Hi, Wilf. This is John.
Hey, John, how you doing?
All right.
I think we're still collecting. We're a pretty good number, so just give it a couple more minutes and then let's get started. And I have turned recording on, so if anybody has any issues, please scream now.
I
And
will.
we'll,
Jerry checking in.
hey, Jerry, how you doing?
Good.
Yeah, great. Well, let me just give a bit of background while everybody's collecting here. There's quite a few more people that have signed up. There is a website. After we finish this, if we've got a few minutes, I'll show how to get there. But gctc.opencommons.org. It was in the link of the invitation. Will get you to a general site, and if you click on data, you'll find all the information about this meeting, the bridge number, the presentations, people who are on the group. And if you're interested, please drop me, Wilfred Pinfolder, an email, and I can tell you how to get signed up to add material to and edit the wiki content. But today we asked Isaac Potaski-Jones, who's the CEO of Tosny, a cryptography and security company, to talk about the work that he's been doing in controlling smart city data. And so I'll just hand it over to him, Isaac, if you don't mind, and let you go from there.
Great, thank you, Wolf. So as Wolf mentioned, we have a little company here in Portland, Oregon called Tosny, and we're about 10 people. And we do a lot of work, particularly with the federal government, but also with commercial companies on security and privacy of data, particularly using cryptography. So if somebody could give me any advice, I put the participant list up on my screen, but I'm not sure if you guys if that's blocking the slide for you guys.
No, it doesn't show,
okay.
Isaac. It's good.
Perfect. Okay, that way if somebody says something, I might be able to catch who's saying it. We can make this. I don't think I packed the hour, so I think we can make this a conversation as long as we can manage to not have audio static and feedback and talk over each other. So if you have questions or you want to jump in or challenge something that I'm saying, I would definitely welcome you to do so. The theme here is to use cryptography and security to control smart city data, and I'll give you a little bit of background on us and our platform, and why we think this is relevant to this group. And I'm open, either as part of the discussion or just as you see things and you want to share them, into understanding how, as we envision a large-scale smart city platform that's integrated between a bunch of these teams here, how would this fit in, if it would fit in. Wilf and I have talked about this a lot, and we think it does, but we'll see. So a little bit of our background. We were founded about 5 years ago by myself here in Portland. We're affiliated with Galwa, who some of you may have encountered. They're a cybersecurity R&D company. They're about 100 people, mostly here in Portland, but also in Arlington, Virginia, and in Dayton, Ohio. They do a lot of cybersecurity R&D for the federal government again. So I myself was there for about 10 years and doing a lot of work with like federal government, intelligence communities. And then we're also currently my spin out here, Tosny, is doing work with NIST Trusted Identities Group, with a few different groups at DARPA, with other companies and that I can't list here. Ironically, the commercial companies, I can't list them, but the government agencies I can. So that's just one of our things. So we've been doing cybersecurity for a very long time. I want to kind of start with some of these really deep questions about smart city data that I think we've all sort of had as context, or we've all been struggling with at one point or another. And I don't think any of this will be surprising to you, and I don't say that this is like the one and only framing of this topic, but I thought it would be good food for thought. So, of course, ownership, who actually owns the data. And we've seen a number of smart city use cases where people aren't actually literally sure what the legal question is and whether that can actually be answered with legal policy. Who houses and stores the data, and where is it stored? Is it stored in the US? Is it stored in the EU? This is a really practical question, both for security, because somebody who stores the data can access the data, but also because of compliance rules. For instance, EU data has to be housed in the EU. Federal data has to be housed in federally approved cloud services, etc. So it really does matter where the data gets stored. And with our SaaS product, we have found that people care a lot as to where the data gets stored. It's not just one big happy cloud. Access, of course, who can access the data? This is a combination of security, of access control, and legal policy. So by that I mean, who can access the data? Well, if you have a security problem and somebody who shouldn't be able to does access the data, that kind of falls in this category. Legally, you can say who is allowed to access the data. So does a warrant or a subpoena provide the data, or a FOIA request, or is it public data? We've seen plenty of examples of cities or whoever collecting data that's really pretty privacy sensitive, and reporters or whoever have requested and gotten access to that data. And there's a question mark as to whether that's a good idea. The data subject, who is the data about, and more often than not, they don't own the data, they don't store the data, and they often can't even access the data about them. So this is a kind of awkward situation for so many of us, that the data subjects are not actually in any meaningful kind of control of the data. So I like those 4 questions here, but all of it kind of comes down to the bigger question of who controls the data. And I would say control is the overlap of that ownership, that storage, that access, and who the subject is and what their rights are. Lots of modern businesses on the internet today, as you know, they run on the premise that you are the product and not the customer. I'm not saying anything new or probably even controversial here. But in other words, you give up your data privacy for free services. And I think probably there's alignment here that should not be the model for smart cities. We should not be collecting data in order to monetize the data or support the infrastructure of the smart cities data collection system by violating people's privacy. Am I saying something controversial there? Does anybody want to challenge me on that, or do we think that there are good models there? I'm actually open to be convinced.
I would add to it, actually. I would say that mostly the cities don't want the liability of carrying the data either, right? So there's actually, beyond the fact that I think citizens with their city data would like to, have a bit more control. I think on top of that, the cities are very sensitive to the fact that they're providing services to the citizens, and they don't want to be having to manage large databases that could be attacked, that could be used to cause problems for citizens. So they're also looking, and most of the conversations I've had with the cities, they're also looking for a way in which citizens can be responsible and manage their own data, and therefore be responsible for their own security. So they would like citizens to take more responsibility.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, what we see in the way that PCI systems are built for credit cards is that kind of what you're pointing to, which is like nobody wants to actually, not nobody, but most websites don't want to hold a credit card anymore. They trust the credit card processor to hold a credit card. They want to utilize that information or a token that represents the credit card, but they don't want the PCI compliance rules to be applied to them. They don't want the liability. They don't want the threat against their users' genuine privacy and finances, and so they don't hold that data for the most part.
So guys, this is Corey. I have a question on this, to be honest with you, because I'm wondering if this is a conscious decision on the part of cities and public authorities or agencies to mitigate risk, or if it is the perception of risk and a lack of familiarity with the technology tools that are out there to mitigate that risk that is driving that decision-making process. And I'll just give you an example. HIPAA is the perfect use case around this, right? HIPAA does not necessarily prevent the sharing of data between public agencies, and yet they use HIPAA as a justification to not share data with anybody. I'm wondering what is the actual driving factor here, and the only reason for my curiosity on this is because I think that it drives a decision-making process around who should control it and how they control it and what those intermediaries can potentially look like.
Yeah, and I don't know, Wilf, if you have in your conversations with cities, if you've gotten to that level of what is the driving concern. I mean, I certainly have felt that there's not picking on anyone particularly, but that there's generally a lack of expertise around cybersecurity and cryptography, that they don't feel like they necessarily have the funding or the resources to build and protect a large scale data set. Would that be a fair reflection?
I think it is. I think Carter's pointing to a really important point, which I think that there's not an easily understandable model that people are comfortable with and we just haven't got there yet. And so I would agree, and I would also agree in the HIPAA space. I mean, in the medical space, there is more fear about HIPAA data than there is knowledge, and people, as you say, use excuse. But I think that boils down to that we need a model that's we need to be able to describe easily to citizens what what the model is. In the absence of that, there is fear. It may or may not be justifiable fear, but the lack of a simple model for people to understand. And I think not only do we need the mechanisms to implement a good data privacy model, but we need to be able to explain it in a short enough term that people get comfortable with it. And people do get comfortable with fairly loose systems. We started off always collecting the carbon off our credit card because we were worried people would get the card. Socially, we've got very comfortable with that now. We don't need the carbons. Our cards are in all sorts of websites and things, and the security is provided by insurance that the credit cards have. So if they get stolen, we typically don't have to pay for the stolen items. So I think there's a model like that we have to get to, but I think it does start with us being able to come up with with a way to state this is how you have control over your own data. And I think if we could do that, I'm not sure how many people would actually spend a lot of time managing it, but I think that it would alleviate a lot of concern that may get in the way of delivering the kinds of services we want to, if people had that kind of general understanding. Does that help, Corey, or is that too complicated?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with where you guys are coming from, and I think that there's space here for consideration of different models, I guess, is my whole point. Because I know that in some regions they have what they call regional data trusts that serve as intermediaries for the sharing of dispersed types of data. They're responsible largely for the security of those exchanges. And so I'm wondering if in the course of this conversation, we can start to unpack this idea of, is blockchain necessary for this type of endeavor? Or is there something that is potentially less, I'm not going to say controversial, but less novel, less new, that potentially is more familiar and tangible to folks?
Yeah, I should mention as I probably will move on here about what the platform we have is. This is not a blockchain platform. So there have been discussions around utilizing blockchain for some elements of identity. Nothing I'm talking about today has anything to do with blockchain, just so you know.
So Isaac, could I weigh in here for a minute? This is Jeff Gauss. And Wilf, you and I have had some conversations about this. There's two pieces of legislation that are in front of the Oregon legislature right now. One is Senate Bill 703, and the other is House Bill 2487. And the Senate Bill 703 is called the Healthcare Information Property Act. And what it does is it takes HIPAA privacy requirements, which says that there's data sharing commentary in there. But this bill goes on to say that in fact, healthcare data is actually personal property of an individual and therefore is subject to personal property rights that are states' rights. And so that bill's being actively debated and looked at. And what it does is it says basically you own your data and no entity can commercialize that data without your express consent. So it's getting at the idea here of individuals owning and controlling their data.
From a legal standpoint.
From a legal standpoint. House Bill 2487 is a bill that is mandating that the Department of Administrative Services of the state of Oregon start to investigate blockchain use cases that would change how state government operates. And in there, there's an amendment that I have authored, which states that the Department of Administrative Services is supposed to investigate, design, and recommend a citizen-centric identifier that can be used across all state agencies. And so this is getting at some of the things that we've been talking about on this call. I don't know where
That's great.
those bills are going to go, but that activity is going on. And that similar legislation is being debated today in the State House in Maryland. So Oregon's first, and then it's starting in Maryland as we speak.
Let me, when we talk, Jeff, I'll get the links for that, and we'll put them up on the wiki so as people can get at them. I know there's a lot of people here who are not in Oregon, but they may be interested in seeing what's going on here, and if other jurisdictions are considering, states or European or other are considering similar legislation, I think it'd be good to know what that is and start, and I'll just get it up on the website so as people can look at it. I think we'd be interested in seeing what other people are doing, and maybe the Oregon stuff would be useful to other folks.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit too about identity in a bit here. Since this is partly a technology group, I'll go into a bit of our technology. And I'm not sure I did a good job here of explaining the model that Wolf is outlining about citizen control. But let me kind of get into the technology model, and hopefully we can level up from there. But so our product is called TOS Store. It uses cryptography to control data. And so what I want to kind of outline here is, to your point about like not going crazy with innovative new stuff, what we do is we really provide solutions in this space of making classic cryptography usable for normal people, normal programmers, for instance. So if you're building a platform today without our stuff, you want to pick up cryptographic toolkit, and I'm not talking about blockchain, I'm talking about classic cryptography, then it's actually very, very challenging to get it right and use it effectively. So what we provide is kind of toolkits at a higher level of abstraction that provide more capabilities, but it's still based on your standard good practices around good cryptography. We're not cryptographers in the sense of we don't have mathematicians on staff or anything like that. We are protocol, logic, and product construction team. So what we're kind of arguing for here is a little bit of a different approach to cryptography. A lot of times I think when people think about encrypting and storing data, securing data with encryption, it's really about that confidentiality primarily, like how do we stop the bad guys from seeing the data? And so what we're really talking about here is about giving the right people control over the data, not just about who sees it. So what we do is we really leverage kind of classic key management approaches that we do in a kind of a new way, which I can get into if anybody's interested, to say who gets to control the data. And so basically we encrypt the data, we have a kind of a wrap around it that's a key that the citizen can control, or whoever owns the data can control, or whoever is supposed to control the data can control. And no matter where it's stored or who owns it or who's it about, what system it transit across or whatever, then the data still retains that encrypted envelope. So the security travels with the data. So some examples of how you could use this are to maintain control of data share with third-party contractors. So you have a data set, you want to grant control, and what we end up doing is using keys to say you can access these parts of these data sets, but without just handing over the entire data set to the other party. We can also give, and this is really getting into the citizen control, we can also give data subjects actual control over who accesses the data that is about them. So the idea here is that potentially with a good identity management system backing it up, but the citizen or whoever actually physically controls the key that encrypts their data. So instead of having a third party like even Amazon or the city say, okay, well the user said so-and-so is allowed to get this data, or so-and-so type of people are allowed to get this data, and then that third party actually holds and grants access to that data. What this does is it says, no matter where it's stored, the city might still store it. What we do is we release keys to the parties who I'm giving access to the data. So I, as a citizen, can say, well, this information about me, my health information, I want to release to my doctor or to this new doctor I'm going to. And the intermediates in that flow, whoever's housing and storing the data, they actually don't even necessarily need to be able to see the data unencrypted in order to do that. So this removes a significant amount of the control from the data storage system. So it matters a lot less who actually houses and pays the bill for the hard drives that the data is sitting on. So because the data lives encrypted and the keys are the things that manage who accesses it. And another example would be, which we've seen a lot, is, oh, your entire cloud infrastructure is very secure, nice job, you did a lot of crypto here, and then you backed it up, whether that's physical tape backup or another logical system like an S3 bucket on Amazon Web Services that you put it on, and then you forgot to secure that. So the idea is that the security travels with the data, the control travels with the end user, the subject, whoever we want to have that control. And the control is very, very powerful. It's not a delegated, a legal, or a policy control. It's an actual physical control over the release of those keys. Any questions about that so far? There was kind of a lot to unpack on this slide.
It's good.
This is John Teeter. I'll make one comment that this is the approach that was taken in the energy space, where data custodians are well defined, and the mechanism of the consumer allowing any data custodian to release their data to a third party is well defined and standardized.
That's great.
So it's all built around RFCs. Well, it's all built around, at the core, the NIST supported best practices. And I'm happy to point whoever's interested to that structure and that standard.
That's great. I'd be very interested. My wild guess, because there's very few systems out there that can support end-to-end cryptography, is they probably did a good job delegating control to third parties so that the user can make those decisions or set that policy themselves. But I would highly doubt that anybody's using cryptography for this today beyond the systems we're deployed in. I simply haven't seen it.
Yeah, my comment was on related to consumer maintained authentication for access. The actual encryption at rest or encryption in transit are defined and institutionally mandated, I would think, I would say, but the keys are not stored with the data, as you're saying here.
Great. Okay, moving on, unless somebody else wants to jump in. So the platform we're providing here does a couple different interesting things. So I like to, maybe taking one step back for anybody who's not real strong on cryptography or security, we like to talk about confidentiality, availability, and integrity, or CIA. Confidentiality is what we mostly think about for security, which is, hey, no, the wrong people can't see the data. Integrity is that the wrong people can't change the data, which is also very, very important, but people think about it a little bit less. And availability is that the data is there when you need it, or the systems are up when you want to contact them. So we're trying to really provide something in all three areas. So part of the argument I'm going to make here is that people want to often start these smart city use cases with public data sets because those are just the easiest ones to get a hold of. You're not as worried about security. You can make open APIs and open data. That's all really great. And I've seen a lot of hesitance in working more with private or sensitive data. And a lot of times people sort of say, well, let's do that a little bit later. We'll start with the public data sets and move on to the more sensitive ones. So what I'm going to argue for here is saying we can use the same system for public data sets as well, because what it gets you is integrity, because standard cryptography gives you good integrity guarantees as well as confidentiality, and availability guarantees. And this isn't really a cryptography thing. This is really just about doing a good job with our Amazon infrastructure, for instance, that has all the backups, the load balancing, the redundancy and all that great stuff that's really important for a SaaS system. So this is pretty par for the course for anybody running a big data set on the internet today. But it has to be said because if kind of like what we were alluding to earlier, if a city, for instance, doesn't really have the resources to manage, maintain, and spin something up, then availability might be one of those things that ends up suffering.
Hey, Isaac, just
Sure.
a quick question on this. So, you're focusing an awful lot on sort of the data and the data migration, but how do the keys flow through this? If you're doing end-to-end encryption, it's really, custodianship is really custodianship of the keys rather than the data.
Right. That's right. Yes, exactly.
So how are you managing and protecting and transferring keys?
Yeah, that is a very deep question. Let me actually just check real quick if I have slides on that in this deck. It wasn't in the stuff I sent around, but I have backup slides. I think I don't, unfortunately, have the kind of deep dive into the crypto here. I love doing the deep dive into the crypto. Maybe I'm not going to get super deep into it, and I'm happy to do it offline because it's subtle and complicated. And maybe not everybody's going to be interested, but if I could try to answer your question in kind of a shorthand way, and then push me on it and tell me if that's interesting enough or if you have concerns. So the basic approach here is that each of the parties who are interacting with the systems, whether those be users or server, like end user citizens, servers that are housing or sharing data or what have you, decision points that enforce policy, or a website, whatever you're doing, each of them have their own one key, their own public-private key pair. There's a pretty standard kind of approach to cryptography, which is to say that you manage a public-private key pair. And what you do is kind of Crypto 101 is like, hey, the public key can be used for encryption and the private key can be used for decryption. So anybody can encrypt something for me at any point. So what we do is for all the data objects, they get encrypted with their own key. This is a symmetric key because that's faster, like AES. They get encrypted with their own key. There's an intermediate key, which is a little bit hard to explain, but I'll do that later if you want. And then the intermediate key gets encrypted with the public key, encrypted by the public key of the party that accesses the data. So then what I can do when I download the data is that I get an encrypted key, I get the encrypted data, and then I can decrypt the key and I can decrypt the data. So it's a little bit oversimplified, but that's the basic idea.
Yes, I'm very familiar with the crypto pieces of it. That was less my question than the policy, because once I have a key that's associated with the data, there's no revocation, right? So it's sort of a one-way handoff, right?
So we have to a first approximation. You're correct that it's impossible that once somebody who you no longer trust has had access to the keys and the data, then they could copy it off and save it, right? So to a first approximation, I'd say yes, right? But what we do is there are some like kind of intermediate things you can do to really help to make that not as big of a problem. But this isn't magic. This isn't DRM, right? So we're not trying to say that, well, you have the data and you can watch the movie, but you can never see the bits. So we're not trying to do that because that never actually works.
That's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
So I'll make, this is John Teeter again. I'll make one more comment relative to the energy services provider stuff. And again, this was relative to a data custodian being granted access by the consumer to give data to a third party. The ability to revoke that was built into the protocol set and standard. So, and again, it's not the key level, but it is the accessibility level that was managed.
Yeah, and I should mention that's exactly what we do. So so we do provide for both key and data access revocation. So if somebody's no longer allowed to see the data, then we do revoke their keys. They can no longer access, they can no longer query the system for the data they're not allowed to get. If they've saved encrypted data, they can still use the keys they've also saved, but they could have done that anyway. So there's really no stopping them from doing that. And then for future data that gets created, it gets a new key so that they can no longer access the data. So it's actually a very strong revocation story. And all I just wanted to point out is it's not DRM kind of magic. You can't really stop somebody with malintent from, if they at one point have access to the data and they're going to download it all and save it off into another point, then that's a very difficult thing to stop. And there are mitigations, but from a cryptography standpoint, we don't attempt to kind of go whole hog into homomorphic or anything like that to stop them. I know that was a little bit of a deep dive for anybody not interested in crypto, but it's I'm happy to go into as much detail as anybody wants there, clearly. Great. So another use case we're seeing a lot is extracting public data from private data sets, sometimes the opposite as well. And so what a platform like this would get you here is that you have a private data set using our end-to-end encryption that gives you confidentiality and integrity. Then you can provide some kind of analysis system. Let's say this is just a node on AWS or whatever you're doing, that private data set, and it can extract public data from that private data set and then provide it again to the platform for the public to be able to see it. So it's a fairly common flow, and this analysis point is certainly a point of danger in terms of saying, like, sometimes we've seen, for instance, if you're just trying to remove PII at this point, you might end up spilling a lot more private information than you think you're spilling. If you just think you can remove somebody's name, address, and phone number from a data set, people won't be able to re-identify them, then you haven't done a lot with privacy, because it's been a big problem. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that this black box is magic and it can make a private data set into something that can be published. But what I am saying is, there are plenty of analyses you can do on private data that you may want to publish aggregate results or averages or statistics and make that into public data. And so this is a system that allows you, for instance, and this does answer some of your concern around revocation, but that what we allow is you can send the analysis basically to the data, and there's kind of a no human in the loop system that where you can say, hey, this is a black box, it does analysis on the data, maybe it gets some kind of a level of approval from the data owners, but the data itself does not go to a third party. You can send the code to the data. You can also send the data to a third party, but this is one way you can do it if you have a little bit of extra need for security on that data. Any questions there? Okay, and then finally, the private data use case, which is where the citizen data gets generated. It might not be generated by them, of course, and in most cases, information about us is not generated by us. We take photographs, we write posts, and we have our name, address, and phone number, but beyond that, most other data, health information, information about what websites we visit and what we think about and care about are created by third parties based on that information that we provide. So private data sets, of course, we want that to be as strongly controlled as possible. If we want it to be available, we want people to be able to get to it when they need it, and we want the citizen to be able to control who gets access to that data like a third party. And again, we can do this with key management. So those are kind of the three use cases. Public data sets, extracting public data sets from private data, and private data sets about citizens themselves. And so we think a platform like this, even if it's not ours, but something like this would be very useful for the smart cities in this kind of data flow. So I could talk a little bit more about what the product is. I don't want to make this just a product pitch, but I'm trying to kind of just get you guys up to speed on what we're doing. I should mention, maybe just a step back, that we have worked with DHS. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, to apply this work to smart cities. So largely, I'm not pitching you guys. I'm looking for partners who have problems of this shape, and we actually already have funding to do work here. So what we provide is, again, innovative crypto. I've gotten into that. It's really easy to integrate into our system. We provide a bunch of software development kits. This is really necessary in these different languages, because the crypto ends up happening in the client system, not on the server. So that means we have to provide some pretty intelligent stuff for you to plug into your Android app or your website or your server or whatever to be able to do this. Then actually, we already have the Node and Python systems. Key management, policy control, and queries. So we're integrated with Amazon's Elasticsearch for queries. Policy management is very fine-grained, so you can say who gets access to what data. And of course, again, we use keys for that. And then we have our SaaS server. It operates on the, we have a couple of them, but it operates on the FISMA FedRAMP cloud. So that's suitable for federal data collection. We're using it for DoD data collection. And of course, there's strong backups, archiving, redundancy, and all that good stuff. So that's kind of just how it's structured and offered. And then maybe it's worth, maybe I'll just jump forward a little bit to Yeah, so a little bit on the status. The product is built and deployed at scale, so we're already using this for large-scale data collection. This isn't kind of a pie-in-the-sky thing. And like I was saying, and this is something I'd like feedback on or thoughts or help, which is that we are actually already funded by DHS Privacy Group to work with Portland and other cities on privacy-preserving approaches to smart city data collection. So if there's an interest here, if you're seeing something, we do have room for a pilot on this contract to secure your data set. And this would go on for a couple of years. The sustainment is relatively straightforward, just as far as most of the cost being kind of an upfront integration and development cost. So DHS is really footing the bill for doing more with data by doing the right thing with data. So we're looking for partners with a platform, with problems and challenges, with projects. Of course, we're always happy to work and be funded, but primarily we're in this use case at this point, we're really looking for partners there. I have more to say technology-wise, but maybe I'll hold off for a sec here and see if folks have thoughts or questions around this.
Do you keep track of who makes edits to the data? Right. You talked about the fact that that I can control who has the right to. But is there a mechanism here by which, if you wanted to look at who made a change to the data, that there is some sort of record of who the last person to access that piece of data was, or is that outside the structure here?
No, it's definitely built in, and it doesn't use like a chain of hashes like blockchain would, or plenty of other crypto systems use that kind of thing too. But it does use kind of just good management around, remembering, like just logging access and logging modifications. It's also a delta-oriented change log. So when you change something, it's versioned. So you can say, give me the latest version of a data record. You can say, give me an older version of a data record as well. So you can get rid of those older versions, but it's also basically, you can set it up so that a malicious actor can't or has a lot of difficulty overwriting or really changing data that they shouldn't be able to, because we do keep the older versions of the data.
Got it. That's good. And so could I be sure that if I had a data wallet or a data file here, and I gave my bank the ability to update my current account balance, that when I shared that with somebody, some third party, that they could be sure that it actually was my bank that wrote that and not me that changed it?
Yes. So everything comes with a digital signature scheme that's similar to, again, what a blockchain uses the same underlying cryptography that we do, which is digital signatures. And so yes, when this is a very important property of a system where a third party is providing data, where you can say, okay, here's a piece of data you're providing me. Here's the proof of attestation that says this is me saying this about Wilf. And so we can both with cryptography kind of say, here's Wilf's permission to access the data, and here's my proof that I generated that data on the behalf of Wilf. It's not, I think a bank account's a really good example of that subtlety there, because sure, you should be able to control who gets access to your bank account. That's extremely important. But you don't get to say you get to write it, right? You don't get to say what your balance is. The bank gets to say that.
Right, exactly. Which is critical to a lot of this, right? That if there's a transaction, then the person that I'm transacting with, in order for that transaction to go through, needs to be sure that I have not modified my records in order to make it look like I have enough money to buy the house, right? When I don't. And the way that we do that in real life is, you go check with the bank and you get direct records. But if that can be written into the record, then that makes the transaction much simpler.
That's right. Yep,
and there are a lot of cases like that in smart cities where you're giving services to particular individuals based on on proof that they live in a particular area, which they shouldn't be able to spoof in order to get cheap parking, for example.
Yep.
So that ability to say that is a record that is controlled by the jurisdiction or whatever. And while I'm sharing it and choosing whether to share it because it's mine to share or not, I can't cheat it.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
And it, to compare, kind of compare and contrast to blockchain, I'm not knocking it because, there's a lot of really interesting use cases for blockchain. But whereas with blockchain, you have a distributed trust model where you're saying, I trust all these nodes to not collude against me, to lie to me about something that happened in the past. But even with blockchain, you still need to know, like, this particular entity is the one I trust to attest this particular data. So we're not using something like that really distributed trust. It's really just more the latter, which is to say that I trust Chase to assert your bank account balance. And so I know Chase's public key, and I can check the signature of Chase's transactions to say, okay, yes, indeed, this is Wilf's bank account balance. You can also do that with blockchain, but there are certain inefficiencies to distributing that ledger and snapshotting it and all the computations upon it, proof of work and all those kind of things. Different blockchains make different trade-offs there. Again, it's really hard to generalize, but this is a really more of a central database system where multiple parties can come and make their attestations about people or really about anything. But then when you plug it into an identity system, it really ends up being attributes about people and who can say what about whom. And who do you trust to say what about whom? Because I can say what your bank account information is, but nobody should believe me.
No, I completely agree. And it does, as you point out, it requires an identity system behind it that we need to figure out how to provide. So there, as you say, there are a number of ways to do this. I think hopefully we will cover several of them in as we go through this and have a chance to understand the pros and cons of each approach.
Yeah, and I want to say a couple of things about identity management since we're kind of segueing to that, which is that I think I would love to be part of helping deploy user-centric city identity infrastructure. There's been a lot of great work, and we worked for years on identity management. It's a really challenging field, mostly from the human and the policy side, but we worked with NIST on this for quite a long time and saw the ups and downs of that NSTIC team trying to really build out an identity ecosystem that could be deployed like at a really broad scale level without having centralized federal control, which is something that I don't think anybody really wanted. So so we have a lot to say about there. I don't have a product in that space. I know a lot about the space and I've built stuff there before, but it is something that I think I have a lot of opinions about. I'd love to be a part of a team helping to build something here. And so what I'll say about that is there are really good systems out there, kind of jump to the end for identity management. There can be open source like Keycloak or Glue, or there's Okta or other closed source or commercial entities as well doing a lot. Keycloak is a Red Hat product. And ultimately what you want out of the system, like for instance, let's say, and I don't know if this is a good idea or bad idea, but let's say that the city of Portland just like had an identity system and any citizen can sign up in either with a password or with a phone number, with a two-factor auth or whatever you want to do, can assert their identity to this system. And maybe they'll send something to your home to really get a stronger tie to identity, an LOA 2 or 3 tie to identity there. But ultimately, the citizen can come and say, here's who I am, and I can prove who I am using some trustworthy mechanism like password or something like that. There's attributes about the user that are stored in this identity system. This is, plug it into LDAP or whatever you want in the back end. It can be pretty straightforward. There's a lot of work already here. Enterprises all do this all the time. There's single sign-on across city services for convenience and consistency. So any city service can say, don't create a new password here. Whatever you're logging into, you can use the city. And also third parties can use the city's identity system to do that. And so any good identity system worth their salt will be standards compliant and provide a million ways for people to plug into it and say, if I trust the city to assert Wilf's identity and attributes about Wilf, and in this case, not his bank account number, but maybe his address or something like that, then you can use a centralized identity system like this. And it's not necessarily totally centralized; it can be federated as well. But I think this is plugging something like this into secure data management is a very powerful approach, and I'd be interested either today or in future conversations to learn more about what who else on the team is doing stuff with identity management, and what you'd like to do going forward. Is there anyone on right now that has kind of strong opinions on identity management stuff?
Strong opinions? Yeah.
Independent of the opinions, I did put a link to the federal kind of world there in the chat.
In the chat. Thanks, John. Actually, there, as you brought up, Jeff, earlier on the discussions that are going on associated with data ownership at the state level. I think these issues are issues that we should start to look, particularly as the legislation gets put together, because it could help or it could hurt to have some of this legislation. If it's put together without an understanding of what's technically feasible, it could both block good practice and undermine what we're trying to do, or it could facilitate it. And so Jeff, I'd love to get the links to the two bills you talked about and get them out there, and let people have a look at them. Isaac, your quick look over. I mean, I think it's a matter of understanding in detail what's being written into the bill, but I think a quick look over it would give a pretty good idea as to whether what they're doing facilitates things like good identity management, good data management, or whether there are issues there. And I think we could save ourselves a lot of pain if we get that right, and if we're able to do it in one place, we can put it up there as an example for other people to look at. I'm sure that other states in the U.S. are going to be looking at this pretty hard, and I think we should be aligning as much as we can with GDPR and what's already been done in Europe. And so, if people can take a look at that, I'll get that stuff up on the wiki.
That's great. Yeah, there's been a lot of really good work, a lot of good science happening here. And there are some places, I believe Canada and Estonia, I want to say, both have really interesting rules around triple blind identity sharing. I don't remember exactly what all the blinds are, but in things like that, you can come and assert something about yourself without revealing who you are. So you can say, I'm over 18. You can prove you're over 18 without saying who you are specifically for use cases like that. You can, you can prove things to third parties without saying, in a way that they can trust, without necessarily saying who is asserting those things or where your identity lives, so that somebody can't go and attack it. And so there's some really, really interesting things going on around that. And it has to do with being pretty fine-grained about how you release information and who you release information to, and where it transits when it goes, so that you can build a system like this, a centralized identity system, without being super creepy and privacy violating by just creating a central point for collecting all this data about people, and then kind of monetizing it or giving it away. Something like, I don't know if KeyCloak has that feature in it, for instance. We do a lot with KeyCloak, so I keep mentioning it. But it's, again, it's an open source Red Hat product that, we could stand up. This is, how kind of like, Wilf, you stood up MediaWiki or whatever it was for this system, and how straightforward and easy that was. I could stand up a KeyCloak system tomorrow. Now, I'm not saying that, because there's a lot of policy work that would have to happen on the legal side, but from the technical side, a central SSO, open source central SSO with lots of redundancy and security on it is not a science challenge. It's really just some good technical work that needs to happen there, but it's pretty straightforward. So to do something like this for the city, ignoring again the policy side, which ends up being pretty challenging. So you can't really ignore it, but for a moment, setting it aside, from the technology side, it's a very tractable thing that we could do there.
Gotcha. No, that sounds really interesting. Other questions, folks? This was really good, Isaac, and thank you. And we have recorded it, and I will post it shortly on the link. Corey, we've got you up next week. I hope you're still up for that. You want to give just a quick idea of what it is you think you can cover next week?
I thought we were up for the following week.
I think you're up next week. Let's just have a
Because it's every other week, right?
No, we've got every week now for the month of March because there was so much material to cover here. So let me see. I can actually bring up the list. I think if you release, I think I can bring up the list of who we have.
Yeah, I think you're asking me to release the
screen. Yeah, exactly. So let's see if I can do this. I should be able to share. I think. Yeah, there we go. I don't know if that's big enough for people to read it. But Corey, I have you down for the 7th of March, if that's okay, talking about the Spelunk stuff. And then I had Sokwu Ri. I don't know if Sokwu's on. Talking about what NIST is doing, and then Mick, I had you down for the 28th. The 21st.
21st, right?
Right. Yeah. So, Corey, are you going to be able to do that? I mean, there's just so much here, right? I didn't want to be pushing this out until June, July. We actually have some real projects here that could be doing some stuff. Both with the city and with private entities, and I think the interest here is in starting to get some commonality. I mean, we can all go off pragmatically and work on projects independently, but I think the more that we understand what the opportunities are and start to align at least the framing of how we handle things like identity for a city and security and data stores. I think that we create an opportunity to have more interoperability between the services, and we're starting to see a lot of that. A year ago, I would have said no city knows what we're talking about here, but I had a meeting yesterday with a group of folks from different metropolitan districts, and pretty much everyone to a man were asking for this, whether they knew this was what they were asking for or not. This is what they were asking for. They were trying to figure out how to have an identity and a decentralized data store that would allow them to interact effectively with their citizens. So, I speeded it up. Yep.
This is John. I just wonder if you want to comment briefly about the opportunities at the OMSI site for a small scale place to try several of the things that have been discussed in these meetings.
Well, John, you're actually, so John Fink is on. He's the lead of the Digital City Testbed Center, which is 3 sites, OMSI being one of them. We're working with OMSI, which is a 17-acre development that's going to be doing a fair amount of construction of new facilities down there. Most of those facilities are going to be built on land that is currently surface parking. And so there's an opportunity there to gather a lot of information about members and how people come down there. And of course, we don't want to put all of that membership data in a centralized database. And then that data can also be used for various educational purposes, much of which will have quite sensitive data about the individual children. So this is a good place to sort of start this. But John, you've got 2 other sites, right? You've got the PSU campus and the UBC campus, both of which are offering to be test beds for this kind of technology. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, and I think I'm on the schedule for April to talk about this more broadly. But I think as I'm listening to these presentations over the last several weeks, having a location where we could try to co-locate a few of these different things and see how they work together and have them as demonstrations where others can come in and not just look at a PowerPoint, but see some data sets that were generated and talk about that kind of thing. I just think there could be some value to it, especially if more of the people who are on these calls saw some value in it for themselves. And so whether the PSU campus is more complicated than the OMSI campus in that it's completely mixed in with the city and the boundaries aren't that clearly defined. University of British Columbia, where I'm at the moment, is complicated because Canada has all kinds of security issues about where data can be stored. It has to be stored in Canada. UBC is a wonderful system to work with, but I think to start off, if we could do a few token projects at the OMSI site, that might be worth pursuing.
Yeah, I agree completely. I have consciously split the sort of technical discussions from the usage discussions, and so I'm showing the website right now that's got all the stuff on the data side of this, but actually behind that there's a Global City Teams Challenge page that where we talk about transportation. We're starting up some work on health and wellness, and of course in both of those cases the underlying identity, transaction, and data store, we would like them to be common, right? We want the citizen to have a data store that they can use for multiple purposes around the city. And so if you're interested in those areas, then click the right boxes in the sort of sign up space, and you'll start getting invites to those. You're right, John. I'd be interested in people's feedback on how much to integrate those, because I was trying to avoid bringing people who are really interested in the technology side of this into the sort of smart city application side. But it does provide a lot of context, and there is a lot of interest in how to use this kind of infrastructure around, transactions with, transit, with, with energy, waste, water, all the city services, and how this could be a platform to facilitate, better sharing of resources and better services generally.
I think what we're trying to do, as you know, is get a few programs up and running with some vendors on one or more of these campuses. And while those are very specific applications, if they're collecting data that we could then bring in some of the sophistication of this user group, there might be some ways to get more value out of it than just doing what the vendor says is the primary application area.
Yes, I agree completely.
This is Isaac. I think you can count me in on something like that. We'd be very interested in a kind of a showcase test bed.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we could follow up offline, Isaac, because there is one project that we're working on with the city of Portland right now, and if there's a way to piggyback some of your work, that might be interesting.
Yeah, and I hope everybody feels the same way. If you do have other sites that you're working on, if there are other jurisdictions, I know there are people from other jurisdictions on the call that maybe, feel free to contact me if you need to get hold of somebody like Isaac to work on a project there, or other people on this call. I think there's lots of opportunity out there, and we want to get these principles that we're discussing here and the mechanisms we're talking about here as broadly deployed as possible. I think the technology is almost the secondary problem. The biggest problem is adoption, right? It's having that approach that works effectively. So totally with you, John. Great. Other questions?
This is Stephanie Batista. Hi, Wilf.
Hi,
Stephanie. I had a question. Hi. This is my first meeting, and my curiosity is the intent of this group really to foster innovation in smart cities, or is this specific deployment in Portland leveraging other work that has been done in other cities? And forgive me if you've already covered this or it's somewhere in the materials and I've missed it.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. I'll do a quick update here, but if I don't cover enough, because I won't go very deeply into it. So this is definitely not just for Portland, right? We have a little bit of critical mass here for a number of historic reasons, but there are folks on the call from Europe and Japan and other places, and we're very specifically looking to bring global expertise to look at what we could build as a data platform that multiple cities could use, right? That we could, you could easily go off with a small team of people here and build a platform for Portland that was, that was Portland specific. The problem is then we're not creating the kind of marketplace we all want to deliver services. If when you write a transit app for Portland, the only place it can be deployed is Portland, that really damages the model for all of us, right? What we want to be able to do is to develop services that can work in multiple cities with a fair amount of transparency and ease, being able to work with an identity that's portable between cities and jurisdictions. So a lot of what we're trying to do here, I know a lot of the people on this call have built most of what we're talking about in one way or another with different approaches. The problem we have is that therefore we're siloing the cities, that if we get a good set of services operating in Boston, it's not going to work in Portland. And I think what we're trying to do is to start to break some of those barriers down. We're not going to be able to just bulldoze them, but I think the more that we get the experts across these fairly complex set of fields starting to think about how to approach a city in a consistent, common way, we'll start to break those barriers down, and we'll start to be able to get to a point where, if you want to deliver say a transit service or a mechanism by which you talk to energy utilities, that there's a lot more commonality between Portland and Austin and Boston and Porto and Paris and whatever, then there is difference, and we're converging over time. Does that help?
It does. I think my only follow-up question to that is, getting all of the experts from different cities, would that imply that there's going to be more of a standardization in how smart cities are developed? And is that part of this group's charter, is to develop maybe a protocol or standardization on how to deploy and develop smart cities?
Yes, there is. I hesitate to say standards because I don't think we're quite at that stage yet, but it is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of the Department of Commerce, that drives the Global City Teams Challenge, which we're part of. And they have, for smart cities, they have deployed something called the IES City Framework, which is intended to be a framework for how we look at city data. And there's a link to that on the wiki. And that framework was supported by European and Asian standards bodies too. So you're absolutely correct that is the direction. But I think the way to think about this is we would like to come up with an approach to this challenge from a technology perspective in a sort of progressive way, with deployments and being aware of what one another is doing, and doing it in a way that starts to allow us, when we go to a city, to start to advise them as to how to get started without getting locked into some proprietary platform, of which there are many out there. Right? We want to make sure that those cities feel that they know how to manage their interaction with their citizens, and that it's done in an open way that allows all of the various business interests on this call to be competitive in delivering services to those groups.
Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate the context.
That's good, and there are new people joining this group all the time, so you're not alone in needing to sort of hear that. I do record these. I'll post this certainly before the end of the day. So if there are other folks that that would like to join this group, they can watch those videos and sort of get a bit of background before they join. I didn't quite get, and maybe we should think up, Corey, as to whether or not you can do next week. But it would be really good if you were able to do that, if that's not too soon.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a conflict at that time on that day because I had it down for the 14th. I'm not sure what shifted, but
I'll sync up with you offline, and if somebody else can do next week, drop me a note, because I'll shuffle around and give Corey another slot. So I'm sorry about that, Corey. I think I know where that broke down, but I'll talk to you offline and we'll figure that out. Cool. This was great. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this is valuable for everybody, and we will be on next week. We'll just figure out how to get the right presentation schedule here. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Wolf.
Cheers. Thanks, and
Cheers,
thanks particularly.
you.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you.
thanks, Isaac.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.